from the oppressor nations whose worldview was determined by their existence on the pedestal of our oppression. African internationalism for the first time allows for Africans and the oppressed of the world to become the subjects of history, something that Marx, his contemporaries, and followers were incapable of doing. Now, the conditions of the real world in the context of the crisis of imperialism are beginning to confirm what African internationalism has so long predicted. The reality of primitive accumulation of capital and the fact that capitalism was born at the expense of the suffering of African indigenous people and is therefore parasitic. The reality of Africans as one people dispersed around the world who are colonized wherever we may be located. The understanding that African people live under a policy of U.S. counterinsurgency in this country. These are some African internationalist ideas whose time has come. For example, Bloomberg.com, the online ruling class finance journal, recently ran a story on a book being published by scholars from Harvard and Brown universities called How Slavery Led to Modern Capitalism. This article uses terms describing enslavement such as commodified human beings and capitalized labor, concepts whose objective reality, long exposed by African internationalism, is now being forced onto the consciousness of the bourgeoisie. Other current writings being circulated by the white population reflect the influence of the theory of African internationalism. Books such as Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Slavery by Another Name, by Douglas, The New Jim Crow, Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackman, the book Complicity by Ann Farrow, and even a recent article by Mike King on the left blogs analyzing the police attack on Occupy Oakland protesters in the context of the policy of counterinsurgency in the city. We understand the material forces at work in the movement of history. We can clearly see the shift in the balance of power between the oppressed and the oppressor, between Europe and the rest of us, between the so-called white man and the so-called black man. The struggle has always been one for power, not against racism. And to the extent we win power, the racism of others is irrelevant. Power is the great equalizer, the fundamental aphrodisiac that is capable of turning a racist of yesterday into a fawning sycophant of tomorrow. The struggle against racism is the struggle of the petty bourgeoisie fighting to integrate into the capitalist world, to board the Costa Concordia of white power. It is a diversionary struggle, reliant on failed philosophical assumptions that must be cast aside as a precondition for moving forward. This is not an innocent issue of semantics. The way this is understood will inform our practice. The struggle against racism presupposes one approach, and the struggle against imperialist colonialism another. Jose Jaffe, quoted in my political report to the fifth issue Congress, to the party's fifth Congress, expounded on the historical emergence of race as an issue in his book, A History of Africa. Offering a materialist analysis, Jaffe had this to say, quote, "Before the slave trade in Africa, there was neither a European nor a Europe." You hear me? Before the slave trade in Africa, there was neither a European nor a Europe. Finally, with the European arose the myth of European superiority and separate existence as a special species or so-called race. There arose the myth of race in general, unknown to mankind before. Even the word did not exist before the lingua franca of the Crusades. The particular myth that there was a creature called a European, which implied from the beginning a so-called white man. Colonialism, especially in Africa, created the concept and ideology of race. Before capitalist colonialism, there were no races, but now suddenly and increasingly there were races. Once born, the myth grew into a reality, unquote. We are not a race, but a nation of people scattered across the globe and defined out of history by our imperialist oppressors, partially through the concept of race. Our national homeland has been occupied in various ways for millennia. Our people have been captured and forcibly dispersed around the world, and our labor forcibly extracted to build the European nation and world capitalist system that define our reality and the contours of the struggle we have been engaged in for the last 500 years or so. The struggle against Africom cannot be characterized as a struggle against racism any more than the liberation of our people in Haiti and the necessary unification to fight in the further rape of Africa and the theft of its resources. In fact, the material conditions Africans suffer worldwide have their origin in the attack on Africa that led to the capture of our national homeland and our people. Our poverty and susceptibility to ignorance, violence, and material want throughout the world, including the US, UK, and the rest of Europe, are all extensions of the subsequent material conditions of existence extant in Africa. Are the Iraqis and Afghans fighting against racism? What about all the people of South America and the Caribbean? Certainly, the bourgeois ideology of racism serves to unite the vast majority of whites and even some of us in support of imperialist agendas, but increasingly, this ideology is running up against the material reality of a global power shift where the oppressed are clearly the locomotive of history. Increasingly, more and more whites are themselves running from their so-called racial designation. Did you know that? Patrick Buchanan, whose worldview is informed by assumptions of white superiority that we recognize as racism, is himself alarmed by the growing evidence that the shifting power relations is chasing whites away from their solidarity with their racial identity. Apparently, this phenomenon has achieved such significance that Buchanan has conceptualized it as ethnomasochism. In Suicide of a Superpower, Buchanan laments, quote, "Questions about the future arise. If the end of white America is a cultural and demographic inevitability, what will the new mainstream of America look like, and what ideas or values might it rally around? What will it mean to be white after whiteness no longer defines the mainstream? Will anyone mourn the end of white America? Will anyone try to preserve it?" One reaction Professor Hisu reports is that among cultural elites, some are shedding their white identity. If white America is losing control, and the future will belong to people who can successfully navigate a post-white, multicultural landscape, then it's no surprise that many white Americans are eager to divest themselves of their whiteness entirely. The day after Obama's inaugural, television host Larry King blurted out to an uneasy Bob Woodward a secret desire of his son. "My younger son, Cannon, is 8, and he now says that he would like to be black. I'm not kidding. He said there's a lot of advantages. Black is in. Is this a turning of the tide?" Unquote. Indeed, black is in. The tide has turned, and it is the future, not because of some defeat of racism, but because Africans are a part of the dispossessed, the wretched of the earth that are overturning a world social system whose ideological foundation is racism, and that is unable to withstand the tide of history sweeping all forms of capitalist parasitism into the proverbial dustbin of history. The anti-racists would have us fight for a place in a dying system, They would have us objectively uniting with our oppressors. They would transform us into so-called house Negroes fighting to save the master's burning house, as Malcolm X would put it. So, I'd like to stop here and let us perhaps discuss what we've already talked about. I know that you took copious notes and made all kinds of marks on the paper that you were using, and I would assume that there are a lot of questions and discussions that should be forthcoming now. So, Uhuru, I'm opening up to the floor, and also, as we stated earlier, to those of you who are participating in the plenary through the internet, various places around the world, I think you can raise your issues with info through info. How we do it? Say it again. DJ. Do the whole thing. Info. It's DJ at Uhuru Radio. Okay. All right. Uhuru. So, anybody? How do we do this, Binga? Do people come to the mic? All right, see if she comes to the mic. Looks like this is going to be easier than I thought. I can just start reading again. Is that it? If you refer to a particular page, it'll be helpful if you indicate that so everybody can know where you are with it. On page 21, in the third full paragraph, you mentioned the occupiers and the Tea Partiers in the same paragraph. How do these forces impact on, how do you see their relationship to imperialism in general? Are their activities generally helpful in the general struggle against imperialism, or do you see them just as a fly-by-night kind of fad? I don't think they're faddish. I think how they relate or impact on the struggle against imperialism depends on us. I think we like to see all kinds of struggle that's happening internal here. I think we like to see, I'm not even upset about the Tea Partiers, because they're raising interesting criticism. They've complained about, the bailout of the banks and stuff like that, and which is more or less they have more or less the same motivation as do the occupiers. I think, but both of them require the imperialism to provide for them as it has been providing before. There was no concern about occupation as long as Africans were the only ones starving everywhere, long police murdering us. Where was the Occupy Wall Street movement, when it comes to dealing with the Indians on these damn reservations, or the Mexicans who are dying like flies, crossing into on their own land? There was no occupation then. Only time the Tea Parties and the occupiers got concerned with the crisis is when it hurt them. They're fighting for white rights. So I don't mind them fighting for white rights against the imperialists as long as we understand what our objectives are and see this as something that we should try to use to forward our struggle to liberate our people, our Africa, and the oppressed peoples around the world. So this is an internal contradiction, just like the Civil War. Just think how much better it would have been the U.S. Civil War is when the so-called South and the North were fighting each other. Africans had our own plan. We had our own separate plan to strike out for freedom and attack whoever it was out there. This is the same difference. So both of them are fighting for the pot. And that's absolutely true. That's what we say, that it turns into a struggle for white rights. Even the so-called socialist movement. What socialism has fought against parasitism? I can read you quotes in this book here. I can read you quotes that we made of the Second International, where so-called communists who were debating the question of whether colonialism should be ended. And they were arguing that if we end colonialism, what the hell is going to happen to Europe? They were saying that we need these resources coming from Africa and from all these other places to keep Europe happening. So they said, we can't end colonialism, we can have a socialist colonialism. That's what they were calling for. And so what we're saying, parasitism is the fundamental feature of capitalism. And that's the thing that neither the Tea Partiers nor the occupiers are dealing with, because it's in the parasitism has actually been beneficial, you know, to their existence. So no, I'm saying, yeah, I think depending on us, that we are going to have to build a revolutionary process and revolutionary movement to take back our freedom, being clear exactly what it is that we're fighting for. And those who can be won, who call themselves any other thing in the world, who can be won to solidarity with the emancipation and unification of African people around the world, those who can be won to unity with the struggle of the indigenous peoples, Mexicans and so-called Indians together, you know, then they should strike out. That's why we've said occupy Wall Street, not the black community, right? You know, say, yeah, go ahead and occupy. But we're trying to also, if they can be won to solidarity with our struggle, right on. Otherwise, it's again a struggle for white rights. Uhuru.
So I appreciated that this market there, where the discussion of racism, pages 11, 23, 24, and 26.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, there is always a question about why are we not fighting for, racist rules, racist perspectives. And I like how we put it out there as far as it's an idea in someone's head instead of an actual material condition. And where you were talking about white people removing their whiteness and giving that up, I've come across people who now use that as a way to say it's not about racism, it's about capitalism as a way to kind of liquidate the struggles of Africans and other oppressed people and kind of homogenize us into one singular struggle. So can you say something about, and that's, integral with like the occupiers,
right.
Can you say something about, how you should really address that, when you come to
yeah, I mean, we did that a little bit here because they're right. It's not about racism. But when you say it's about capitalism, it's about parasitic capitalism. Deal with that. And parasitic capitalism is responsible for everything that we see in the so-called ghettos and barrios throughout this country and the oppression of everybody around the world. So if you're really opposed to capitalism, Marx said it. I quoted Marx here. When he said that what they call the wage slavery in Europe required as a pedestal slavery pure and simple in the New World. What that meant is that the white people, the white workers, etc., whoever they are, they suffering what they characterize as wage slavery, and even that's an interesting concept, right? Wage slavery, right? They suffer, but their suffering is a pedestal of black people. They suffering on the backs of everybody else. So your shortcomings, you have a problem as a wage slave because it's hard for you to afford the automobile. You work 12 hours in a factory creating automobiles and hard for you to afford it, right? But the issue, the greater issue is, and your ability, and the question is whether or not you identify with the Africans who are in Guyana or Guinea-Conakry, where the bauxite came from, right? And living in the worst kinds of conditions, not even able to reproduce ourselves as a people, right? To provide the resources that went into that factory to make the car in the first place that you can't afford to buy right now. I mean, so I'm saying is that they have to we have to bring them face to face to the fact that it is parasitic capitalism. If you're interested in opposing capitalism, stop beating around the bush and deal with the fundamental question that the pedestal upon which all capitalist activity rests, and that's the enslavement and colonization of everybody else on the world. So I unite with you. I unite with you. You're right. This is what we've been saying all along. It ain't, and we're glad you caught up with us on this picture. It ain't about race. It's about capitalism, but it's about parasitic capitalism that has been responsible for everybody else's misery that you are now assuming that you might be joining. I've even heard, since the thing that's happening in Greece and Europe, they're burning up stuff in Greece right now, right? I've even heard economic ministers in Greece saying things like we're sort of like third world, like we've never expected to have this kind of experience, as Greeks, and now we are experiencing the same thing, not quite, but, but you know, as black people and other people around the world. And what I really want us to understand is that increasingly we're seeing a certain kind of, like Larry King's son, you know, that there have to be, there's a shift in consciousness that's happening. And it doesn't mean that it's all like his son, you know, that's responding to a shift in the material conditions in the world. And even people who don't understand a damn thing about political economy, theory, etc., they are being affected by it, and their brains will be affected by it as well. You know, so that's what we're taking. We unite with you, you know, and take up this this shovel, because we grave diggers for parasitic capitalism, which means that you know, Steve Jobs' company will not be able to get the coltan the way they used to get it from Congo to make them iPhones and the rest of it. Which means that all these resources that you got coming, filling up the refrigerators from Mexican stooped labor, you know, won't be coming like that anymore. Which means that now you will have to take your chances with the rest of us. You understand? As opposed to assuming that somehow your whiteness, you know, allows you to say, well, it's not against race today, it's against capitalism. We all in the same boat. Hell, we were all in the same boat during slavery. You know, it wasn't like we rode ourselves over here. You know, we were down there and you were up there. So being all in the same boat is not a really profound statement, is it? Yes, comrade. Uhuru.
I just wanted, well, first of all, I wanted to salute this plenary and the 40th anniversary of African People's Socialist Party, and to say from the African People's Solidarity Committee, it's a very great honor to be here today and to be able to participate in this historic process. I really appreciate the political report and this theoretical discussion that you're bringing out there. I think it is brilliant and very profound. I just wanted to say that I think that the question of understanding, African nationalism and the significance of it is so important for us, for the whole movement. And the way that you took the question, as Marx defined it, as primitive accumulation of capital, and then turned that into the reality of the human face of that, what that meant for African people and for peoples around the world, and what that meant for Europeans. And it is just so key, the question of parasitic capitalism, like you're saying. And out of that comes the understanding of white people on the pedestal, and Africans and oppressed people making up the pedestal. And what that means, that's the weak link of imperialism, and this defines the question of racism, it defines the question of class and neo-colonialism. All of these things, like you're saying, they were theoretical questions that couldn't be solved prior to African nationalism. And I guess the thing that, you say in there that, even revolutionaries don't understand this, that if we look at the whole, past wave of national liberation movement from like the 50s, 60s, 70s, that they were up against the wall because they didn't understand this question of primitive accumulation and parasitic capitalism. And it seems like now that the Soviet Union is defeated, and therefore, in a way, Marxism is defeated, that all the struggles, whether in the Arab world, whether in Africa, whether in Venezuela, they're just waiting to be able to get this theory, because it's a theory for everyone. And I just wanted to see if you could comment.
Yeah, I've been struck at different times by, I've heard Comrade Fidel Castro, some years ago, he used to really sound the alarm that if things didn't happen differently, it could mean the end of the world economy. I mean, he was really upset about that notion. And I'm trying to figure out why the hell would that be upsetting, Because the world economy consists of a serious dialectic, of a disaster for most people, and just it benefits Europe and North America. Increasingly, we saw certain parts of Asia benefiting from it a bit. And then it dawned on me that one of the differences in how Comrade Fidel would see that and how you should see this is that we are everywhere. Fidel lives on an island that required certain relationship to the Soviet Union, and now hopefully a certain kind of stuff from Venezuela. And as astute and knowledgeable as he is, that impacts on how he perceives the whole world. But we are a part of a land 12 billion square miles. We talk about Africa. And we're talking about almost 2 billion of us, 1.5 billion of us scattered around the world. We are everywhere. And my conscience is informed by this practical, objective reality. It's not just some theory that fell out of the sky. I didn't read it in the Bible or something like that. What I did was discover that we are everywhere. And that's why in this room right now, there are Africans who were born in Panama whose grandparents are still in Jamaica. We're in Jamaica. We're in Congo. We're here. We're in Canada. We're all over Europe, right? We're all over the continent of Africa. My consciousness is in what the possibilities are. My consciousness is informed by that reality. So the new world economy, we can define that world economy. I don't speak as somebody from St. Petersburg, Florida. I speak as a part of an African nation that's coming together, right, to reclaim Africa and our resources from all over the world, both human and material. That's the lens through which I view the world. And so I think that this has made it possible for me to be able to perceive some things, that somebody in that place isolated in a certain kind of way, requiring those external, forces, for survival. The truth of the matter is, a unified Africa and African people would never have to see another white person if we didn't want to. Would never have to rely on any resource from any place else. Africa is resource rich. That's why imperialism is going to die there. That imperialism started there, right? And now what you see is that this crisis of imperialism, everybody's now going back to Africa to try and get as much as they can to rescue themselves. You see? And so that's our Africa. Those are our resources and what have you. And we have to have the ability to perceive the world from that vantage point as opposed to be running around in St. Petersburg, Florida, fighting against racism, fighting for more welfare, fighting to get somebody like us. Why the hell would you want somebody who kicked your ass for 400 years to like you? You must be, that's a real defect, you understand? The objective has to be to take back our future for ourselves. And we can see the whole world. And so if you read even some of the stuff from Marx, he talks about how in order for capitalism to be born, he talks about it had to be a massive amount of capital and labor power. It came from where? It came from the colonies, it came from Africa, all of it. We created that. And now this thing is in a crisis, and we're still in the same damn places from whence we created all the wealth. It's our wealth. Why the hell can't we claim it? And that's what we have to have the ability to do. So yeah, and so this will help. I believe what we recognize now, it breaks us out of this theoretically limited, place where you can't see the whole world, you can't see everything. And so, and this is really important because where in the final analysis, practice and the objective reality is what theory is born of. And the ability to have good theory depends upon how well what is in your head is a genuine reflection of what is in the real world. And so we understand the world, and then from this, theory, emerges about the nature of the world and our place and destiny in it. And anyway, I know I went off on a tangent, but I think that right now, what is so magnificent about this is that you can go to Sierra Leone and have the same damn discussion that we're having right now. Right now. You can go to Canada and birthplace and can't have the same discussion we're having right now. You can go to certain parts, other parts of Africa. You can go to Brussels, where NATO is headquartered, have the same discussion we're having right now. You can have it in United Kingdom. You can have it in France. You can shake up Sarkozy, who is with the audacity to go to Senegal and talk about how black people ought to be thankful for what France has brought to us in form of civilization. This discussion is something that's spreading across the globe. And it will impact on the conscience of everybody because it answers the questions about why Cuba's in the situation it's in. Then the Cubans can answer that by themselves in this little tiny place. The Vietnamese can't answer that by themselves in this little tiny place. But there's a whole world that's shifting, and we are in the center of it. And the thing that's so lovely at this time and place is because as Africans, we are always underestimated. We are still the proverbial invisible people. So while they make all their plans about continued domination of the world, damn it, we are gearing up to take back what belongs to Africa and African people and to overturn the social system based on misery and slavery. Yeah. The point that I would make is that what our responsibility is to define our reality. And I think this is really important. I'm glad you raised that question. Because theory, for it to be meaningful, our theory, can't just explain the reality of black people. That ain't no theory. That's, Pan-Africanism is not a theory, it's a concept. It can't just explain, we explain the world and our place and destiny in this world. In so doing, we explain Marx and why he might have come to certain kinds of conclusions and everybody else. But it doesn't prevent us, if there's anything valuable that we can extract from Marx or anybody else, from extracting that. So that's one thing. What was the other thing about that? About race and...
He was asking how you define race and racism.
I just did. It's the ideological, race is a construct. I mean, the imperialists decided, and you can get whole books on that. I'm telling you, they have written all kinds of books on it, and none of them makes any sense. None of them makes any sense about what race is and who the races are. Race was something born at the same time the European nation was born. This is what's really really extraordinary, because at the same time Europe was defining itself, the Europeans were defining themselves as so-called nations. They were defining the rest of us as races. Go back, it's the same time, it's the same time frame. And so, that's part of what was happening. So race is like I said, it's a construct. It's something that was invented, that was created, and it means whatever they want it to mean at any given time, And a racist, if you will, is somebody who accepts the ideological assumptions that were born of the process of enslaving Africans and colonized Africans and enslaving the rest of the world. So that worldview is a racist, is what we refer to as racism. It is the ideological underpinning of capitalist system itself, worldwide. It is the ideology that grips certainly most white people, and even many Africans, that will have them unite with and justify the oppression of Africans and other peoples around the world. That's what racism is. It's an idea. It's ideas. So if you want to solve a problem, you can debate the idea if you want to. I mean, I don't mind that, debating the idea under certain circumstances, but the real solution to our problem is not the ideas in their heads, right? It's the conditions that we suffer from because we don't have power over our own lives. So rather than debate a racist about being a racist, I would prefer to make ours a movement to get the power so that we could defang those who are racist and keep them from doing anything bad to us. But more than that, if you get the power, I'm telling you, somebody, everybody would join Larry King's son. Get the power. And that's what the point of, whether he was intending to make it or not, that's the point Buchanan was making. He's talking about with Obama's election, it seemed that black people were on the ascendancy. We have the power. And so since they got the power, I need a tanning bed. Uhuru.
Just want to really unite with this whole discussion, and I just have sort of a comment. I'm in the Uhuru Solidarity Movement and the African People Solidarity Committee, the organization of white people who works under the leadership of the African People Socialist Party. Before I met this movement and joined the Solidarity Movement, I had some awareness of African people, or as I understood at the time, black people in this country, as being oppressed. But I did think, oh, it's racism. And it was through these kinds of discussions that I was able to understand the difference between understanding it as racism and understanding it as colonialism. And like you said earlier, Chairman, that it's not just a semantic thing. Because that's what I thought at first. I was like, all right, fine, you call it colonialism, I'll call it racism, but you know, it's the same thing. But then I realized that that understanding impacts upon what you do to overturn it. And it's critically important, actually, because you talked about last month at an APSP conference how I think in the 80s there was this group that understood the struggle as against white supremacy.
Yeah.
And the party was saying it's against colonialism. And the difference is that if you understood it as white supremacy, you joined this white left group that didn't do anything. And if you understood it as against colonialism, you joined under the leadership of the African Revolution. And it's the same thing now with the whole idea of racism.
Yeah.
And the Uhuru Solidarity Movement is really taking this question on amongst the white community. We're going to be holding a national convention where the first day is dedicated to struggling around the question of racism versus colonialism. So just I really appreciate the leadership from this political report.
Uhuru, I want to say that during the 1970s, as a comrade, another organization, when he saw us, we were really attacking this whole thing around racism. He said, well, yeah, I kind of understand what you're saying, but we can't say that because right now we just got to be, we got to raise this fight against racism. And then recently, the same comrade, who's the same comrade, was wanting to build a U.S.-wide movement to have conferences, around the United States against racism, where, as a consequence, we would come up with a collective statement to Obama to have him to hold a national conference against racism. I mean, what's this? What in the hell is this? And of course, the anti-racists, for one, like white anti-racists, is something that I can understand, because that must be one of the most self-satisfying things in the world. I mean, to be a white person, who come from a situation where everything we got, all the value we've accumulated, a whole sense of self comes as a consequence of all these terrible things we've done to Africans and other people in the world, and all they want to do is be accepted by us. All they want to do, is for me, have me to like them. You understand? And what an incredible thing. I mean, I'm not talking about white people even having consciously thought about this. That's the world that white people grow up in, where the assumption, and that's what's so startling when they meet me or you. You meet somebody, now who's got a whole different take on things. You understand that what I want is my power. And that's why every time you say, I want black power, they say, well, what about the white people? And we say, get a job and take your chances with everybody else. That's what about the white people. You understand? Shit. Because it's your worldview. And our worldview has been shaped and molded by this terror and it's been terror. People, the existence of African people, every aspect of our lives, in the schools, everywhere, in some form of coercion that says we have to act a certain way, do a certain thing, talk a certain way in order to be successful. Now, we grow up with this whole sense of terror that has become normal. It's like, if you grow up, if you live in a house with somebody, with smelly feet, you stay in there long enough, you forget the feet stink. You have to go out and then come back in and say, wow, what is that, right? And that's the way it is. We live with this smelly imperialism, the smelly relationships, the terrible things that are imposed. It becomes normal. It's normal for the cops to be everywhere in your community. It's normal. But it's a form of ongoing coercion that's there every aspect of our lives, even on the television. Even your Uncle Tom Lickspill, bootlicking, butt-kissing preacher is everywhere that we go. That we experience some form of coercion, every aspect of our lives. You know? And so it's a powerful thing that we have to contend with. And that ain't no racism. That's somebody else having power of our lives. And we have to take it back. And I won't be satisfied with anything else, and I'm hoping you won't either. Because my position has been a long time, independence in my lifetime. And y'all ain't going to cheat me out of this one. Comrade. Uhuru.
That's what to say. Thank you, Chairman. God allows us to be leadership part of this world changing. So we are participating in this world changing very privileged position because of the theory developed. And as I say, whenever I'm here or whenever the chairman puts your report, it's like, this book, ABC or communism is being repeated. I think that's basically what we're here for, and it should start with African nationalism and other stuff. And just on the question of racism, you might have touched on that already. We still have the experience Africans who divide. It's not just Africans, like in Europe, UK, whenever somebody begins to articulate African self-determination, you are racist in reverse. This is happening. And I'm sure some people are still listening probably today, and we can just comment on that. And on page 14, there is this quote, I'm not sure if it's from Brzezinski, when it says, this is true in such large and self-confident state as India or China.
Yeah.
As it is in Copenhagen. I'm sure people probably say, well, like in my case, India and China, you can understand that. Why Congo and Haiti?
That's splendid. Yeah. Why Congo and Haiti? Why does he, and of course, that's the African question that he's dealing with. Here is this is the imperial domination. That's the Africa question he's dealing with. I don't even know if he is conscious that he's connecting it in that way, but why Congo and Haiti? And of course, one thing, it's the same damn people, this is redundant to say Congo and Haiti in some ways. But I think that this whole notion of racism in reverse, for a while, this is something been reflexive, coming from the imperialists as we begin to move and take back what belongs to us. Then it's a way of saying you're acting just like me, just like us, in some ways. It's imperialism right now is in a real struggle, ideological self-defense. This is a book, a journal called Foreign Affairs. It's a journal of the thinking of the bourgeoisie. This is the Rockefellers, people tied to the Rockefeller Trilateral Commission. It's an important journal. Brzezinski is in here, Fukuyama, who we'll quote, is in here. People who are the thinking representative of the bourgeoisie. This is one of the places where they present their ideas. How many people here are familiar with Machiavelli? I don't mean Tupac. Because that's where Tupac gets the Machiavelli thing. It's from somebody in what period of this in Italy? What period of this would this have been in? Would this have been? During the Renaissance and there was this thing that Machiavelli wrote. I think it's called The Prince, and where he was trying to sell his services and his ideas and his views to the extant ruling class. I think it was the Medici. Was it the Medici that was in power at this time in Italy? Of our party's existence, we have been the bulwark of the African liberation movement in many ways that must be understood by party members if we are to have the necessary insight, enthusiasm, and confidence to complete our mission to lead the struggle for the liberation and socialist unification of Africa and African people worldwide. After the military defeat of the Black Revolution of the 60s, it was our party that played the pivotal role in the organizational, political, and ideological battles to defend and rebuild the struggle for liberation and independence. The assassinations, imprisonments, organizational destructions, and political coups all occurred with the accompanied mission to undermine the struggle for independence and liberation. They all supported the politics of neo-colonialism, assimilation, and various forms of accommodation in opposition to revolutionary national liberation. They were designed to reinstitute passivity on the part of the oppressed, recognized by Brzezinski as necessary for successful empire. Killing Patrice Lumumba was not sufficient. It was also necessary to replace Lumumbaism with Mobutuism. Similarly, while the political objective of the U.S. was the removal of Kwame Nkrumah from power, the ideological objective was to replace Nkrumahism with neo-colonialism, not just as a political reality, but also as a clear, acceptable ideological alternative. In the U.S., Malcolm X was killed to remove him as a political presence in the world, but he was also murdered because of the power of his ideological effectiveness in raising the issue and organizing around revolutionary independence in opposition to religious obscurantism and pacifist assimilationism. Martin Luther King Jr., himself an assimilationist of sorts, was murdered because of his growing ideological advocacy of anti-imperialist resistance as opposed to the opportunism within his own organization and tepid anti-racist legalism of groups like the NAACP and others whose analysis limited them to struggle for acceptance within an imperialist U.S. When the U.S. domestic counterinsurgency program to crush our movement was formalized within the Federal Bureau of Investigation as COINTELPRO, it clearly identified those who rejected pacifism and demanded liberation and independence as those to be discredited and neutralized as so-called black nationalist hate groups. Attacking the pro-independence sector of our movement was not only designed to remove us as political agents within the U.S., but it was also designed to elevate the stature of pacifists, assimilationists, and liberals of every stripe and nationality, including many who characterize themselves as communists. When the influential newspapers of the Black Panther Party and Nation of Islam had been effectively neutralized, it was the burning spear that projected the ever-developing aims of our movement, not as eulogizer of the fallen, but as the primary advocate of the basic ideas that U.S. counterinsurgency was designed to silence. The burning spear predated the African People's Socialist Party by several years, having been founded as a political organization of JOMO, one of the founding organizations of the party. The spear served to keep the masses connected to the ideals and surviving organizations of the pro-independence movement. Through the spear, we were able to fortify the morale of our people who were suffering a vicious counterinsurgency defeat resulting in political assassinations, mass police roundups of militants, and imprisonment of some of our leaders, including this writer. The burning spear reported on the victories of the peoples of Vietnam and the ongoing struggles throughout the Americas. We exposed our people here to the struggle in Zimbabwe and its connection to the movement within the U.S. The New Jewel movement of Grenada, the resistance of the people of the U.S. imposed dictatorship of the Shah of Iran were all kept before Africans in the U.S. and other areas of the world while newspaper was distributed. We wrote of the continuing battles of the besieged leaders of the Black Panther Party and the provisional government of the Republic of New Africa, as well as those we were involved in ourselves. The burning spear was the primary organ used to convey to the world the ideological developments of our party that pushed our struggle forward, moving it beyond the stagnation imposed on it by the repression that resulted in many who survived the assassinations and imprisonment being forced into exile or often into inactive underground existence. It was our party that understood and identified the war being waged against our people and movement as counterinsurgency, a counter-revolutionary response to struggle that utilized every conceivable method of suppression, economic, psychological, and political, but rested on a military foundation. We studied, understood, and explained the science of counterinsurgency, its motives, its goals and objectives, and its main strategy of resource and population control. We saw it employed in every aspect of our lives as colonized African subjects. We showed how the protective villages and strategic hamlets used by the British in Africa and Asia and by the U.S. and Vietnam were brought to the housing projects of the U.S. Drugs, first heroin from Southeast Asia, where the U.S. was fighting to keep the people of Vietnam, Cambodia, and the so-called Golden Triangle under imperialist domination, and then cocaine from South America, where the U.S. was waging a brutal and bloody counterinsurgency against the Sandinistas of Nicaragua and other revolutionary projects, were used by the U.S. as counterinsurgency tools against the revolution in the U.S. It was our party that exposed the fact that the U.S. government was the real drug pusher, that denied Africans the right to employment in the legal capitalist economy as a method of maneuvering us to economic dependency on the illegal capitalist drug economy. This was during a time when other African liberation organizations had succumbed to and joined with the counterinsurgent imperialist attack on the African working class. It was our party that exposed the fact that Africans were not fighting a drug problem, but a drug economy that was used to keep a faltering U.S. economy afloat, push African people out of revolutionary political life, and justify a counterinsurgent war without terms on an oppressed and colonized community now successfully demonized as pathological, drug-crazed, and criminal. The White House is the rock house and Uncle Sam is the pusher man became the party mantra embraced by the African masses throughout the U.S. One party-influenced militant rap group launched a successful album that revolved around the U.S. drug-imposed counterinsurgency. This aspect of counterinsurgency resulted in total disrupted families and communities, thousands of violent deaths, and millions of mostly young Africans shuttled into a burgeoning colonial prison system that also brought revitalized economic life to dying rural white communities. The fact that we continued struggling against U.S. domestic colonialism after our movement had been crushed by the counterinsurgency meant that we were obliged to solve many of the problems of the revolution as they reveal themselves in the real world. This is how we came to recognize that colonialism, pure and simple, the ubiquitous presence and authority of the so-called white man, shifted its essential form in the U.S., just as it has done in Africa and other areas of the world. When the movement for liberation grew to an extent that masses rose up with the blood-curdling cry of "kill the white man," it became impossible for white power to exercise its rule directly. Indirect rule, neo-colonialism, white power in blackface, when an obvious transfer of political power from the white colonizer to the black colonized serves to obscure the fact that the white colonizer continues to dominate the colonized through control of the economy, and hence control of the politics of the colonized became necessary. Neo-colonialism is a concept developed by Kwame Nkrumah to define the new face of colonialism. Nkrumah taught how the continued control of African economies allowed for indirect rule by the same powers. However, it was our party that defined African neo-colonialists according to their class character. It was we who recognized the role of class in the implementation of neo-colonial rule. This had not been previously done. We saw how the Kenya model used by the British against the anti-colonial struggle in East Africa was being played out in the U.S. In Kenya, after the legitimate revolutionaries were murdered by the British in a horrendous bloody affair of mass torture, mass imprisonment, and unspeakable near-genocidal mass murder. The British promoted the idea that a pliant neo-colonial surrogate was a legitimate revolutionary to whom they transferred the appearance of political power. In the U.S., this has been done mostly through elections. After many Africans had been won to the idea that political power could be won through the ballot box, many of those who had opposed the real black power advocated by Malcolm X, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Black Panther Party, and a host of others fighting for self-determination, including militant assimilations like Dr. Martin Luther King, were raised up by the white ruling class as representatives of black power. They were helped into political office after the revolutionaries were murdered and revolutionary organizations crushed by counterinsurgency. On the rare occasion that representatives of the legitimate aspirations of our people were elected to office, the counterinsurgency worked with skill, brutal efficiency to undermine and eventually initiate so-called regime change to replace them with adherents of capitalism, colonialism, and patriots of the white nationalist state. Various loyalty tests were devised to determine the trustworthiness of African candidates for office. If they refused to denounce certain designated African leaders, they invited the wrath of the white ruling class, media demonization, and diversion of campaign monies to more amenable candidates. Although the electoral process became the primary method of designating and vetting neo-colonial leaders, it was not the only method. Various leaders of mass organizations functioned as neo-colonial surrogates as well. Obvious examples are Jesse Jackson becoming the Africa representative for U.S. President William Jefferson Clinton, and the current role played by Al Sharpton as water carrier for Barack Hussein Obama, his latest, most obvious display of neo-colonial fealty to imperial white power. Let's talk about that. Can we discuss this section that we just dealt with around mostly counterinsurgency? When we first started raising this issue of counterinsurgency, I mean, it was a real struggle. We did all kinds of things. We organized conferences. We had a conference here in St. Petersburg, Florida, where people came from various places to discuss this whole question of the counterinsurgency that was impacting on us. We saw the government, for example, of Washington, D.C., a legal coup against the regime of Barry. What's his name? Marion Barry. And, you know, Barry was no friends of African. He was the first, by the way, secretary of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But, and many of the people who elected him were members of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But he had committed all kinds of offenses against the general African population. But it was not, that was not his crime as far as the imperialists were concerned. They had serious problems with the Barry regime, and they initiated a whole campaign that did a legal coup and took over the government of Washington, D.C. I don't remember all of the details about that now, but this was just one of the things that was going on at the time where counterinsurgency activity was really clear. And, things that happened in housing projects. The certain IDs that, people could not just go to the housing project, couldn't go see your grandmama anymore. Of course, that's being reintroduced today with gang initiatives and anti-gang, what do they call? Gang, is that anti-gang initiatives and injunctions and all this other kind of stuff? Population and resource control. Fundamental strategic objective of counterinsurgency. We taught this. We taught it to, like the movement at large. We had conferences, we had mobilizations, everything to try to win this understanding within the general so-called movement, pro-independence movement. Nevertheless, we saw some of the people who were supposed to be in the independence movement cooperating, if ignorantly so, with the counterinsurgency that was attacking our community. But we introduced that whole issue of counterinsurgency. This is what's happening to us. And that's why NPDUM initially was organized to deal with the counterinsurgency. Because with the counterinsurgency, what had happened is they destroyed the organizations. They dispersed the membership of most of the organizations. You know, like at a time during the height of the Black Revolution of the 60s, where you couldn't go to a city in this country where you didn't find somebody walking down the street with a Black Panther Party newspaper trying to sell it to you, or even from the original Nation of Islam. We were connected with each other, you know, through these journals, through the Burning Spear newspaper, etc. That even forced the bourgeoisie newspapers to have to say something because we were getting our own independent information. So they had to at least try to put a spin on this reality. But then, you know, when the counterinsurgency, they knocked those papers out, they destroyed the organization, they assassinated leaders, etc. They dispersed the members of those organizations, and then pretty soon, not only did we not know what was happening in Vietnam, like we used to be able to find out from the burning spear of the Black Panther Party or of the Nation of Islam, which, by the way, did some incredible reporting on Vietnam in terms of photos and stuff they showed of what the U.S. was doing in those places. Not only did we not know what was happening in Vietnam, not only did we not know what was happening in some other part of the country, we didn't even know what was happening in the same community anymore. The bourgeois media, you know, came forward with an explanation by saying that the militants were manipulating the media, therefore we ain't writing nothing about them, that kind of stuff. Because I was able to pick up, once upon a time, a newspaper in St. Petersburg, Florida, and find out what the hell we were doing in Houston, Texas, because the white folks would write about it. And if they didn't write about it, you know, the Black Panther Party newspaper had something or some other journal. So all of that was gone. And so with that, the sense of connectedness, you know, within our movement happened. And so people, you know, had lost sight of, you know, like of the revolution, and we had to rebuild the revolutionary movements. We couldn't get somebody to join the revolution, you know. We can get them perhaps to fight against the slumlord who was trying to evict them. We can get them perhaps to try to fight against some merchant who was, you know, selling rotten food and doing those kinds of things. We can get them perhaps to deal with what happened to their child in the school. And so NPDUM became the vehicle through which we tried to mobilize African people back into political life using immediate experiences and contradiction of colonialism to try and raise them up to a level of revolutionary consciousness. That's why NPDUM was created in the first place. First in Oakland, California in 1989, where we were involved in serious struggle. It was called People's Democratic Uhuru Movement. And then in 1991, of course, in Chicago, where we consolidated the national conference to build NPDUM, something like 25 states and I think cities in 22 states came together, and we built, you know, the National People's Democratic Uhuru Movement. And now, of course, it's the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement that we have, because we're dealing on an international level. But that was the impulse, that was the basis, that was the thing that kicked it off. Comrade Gaida, Uhuru.
And, you know, in fact, the slogan of NPDUM was defend the national democratic rights of defend the national democratic rights of the African community and defeat the United States government counterinsurgency war against the African community. Yeah. That was going hands in glove with the war on drugs, which we also termed a war against the African community. We said it was no war on drugs, it was a war against the African community. But I think that one of the important things that the counterinsurgency contribution of African internationalism did was that for the first time it began to expose that the United States government was treating the African community population in this country as an enemy population. Yeah. Because the counterinsurgency was a war, it was a military term. We saw counterinsurgency happening throughout the world. Any place that they hated somebody, or any place that they wanted to capture or seize the resources, you know, they had counterinsurgency, but nobody saw it happening internally as it was happening to African people. And so we really exposed that the African community, African population inside the United States, that there was no democracy for the African population, but in fact that the United States government was waging a similar war, and in fact the thing that helped them to perfect the war everywhere else was the war that they were waging against the African population in this country. So I think that leadership, you know, in terms of the counterinsurgency, really began to help us to recognize ourselves as a nation within a nation that, you know, that was attacked by the United States government.
Uhuru. I do think that was extremely important. Comrade, yes.
Oh. Page 31. Indirect rule, neocolonialism, white power, and blackface, with an obvious transfer of political power from the white colonizer to the black colonized, serves to obscure the fact that the white colonizer continues to dominate the colonized and control the economy, and control of politics of the colonized became necessary. And I'm saying that because it's really important when we talk to Africans in the organizing capacity that we help them to understand neocolonialism and white power and blackface as it applies to leadership and also just in our circles as we organize there as well. And that there's some sort of blanket pass for every African that is helping us organize that or is supposedly organizing as a way just to say that, you know, they're black, so they're the past, you can accept that. And that allowed for Obama to still continue to be popular among many of Africans, and it allows Africans within the context of predominantly African countries to blame in some kind of, you know, to really focus their discontent with the neocolonial leaders of those regions instead of the disasters of what those are. So if you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that's really important. One of the most difficult struggles that we've encountered, and when I say we, in this instance, I'm talking about what was clearly a part of the African liberation movement. The Black Panther Party was ambiguous on its relationship to the African liberation movement. You know, I've heard it referenced like part of the Black Power movement, but it vehemently, in some instances, made it clear that it was not a part of the Black Power movement. I will never forget the time when Bobby Seale was on trial. It might have been in Connecticut, where he did, we'd come in, and before the judge came in, he'd do a little spiel to the people at the trial and raise up his fist. And then after the judge came back in, one of the bailiffs complained, saying that he gave the Black Power sign, and Seale wanted to make it clear that was not the Black Power sign, that was the all power to the people sign. So, you know, the Black Panther Party was really ambiguous, and most often would characterize somebody who was raising the question of Africa as a cultural nationalist. And that's because we did fight cultural nationalists. We had serious cultural nationalists, but they were ambiguous on that question. Sometimes, you know, the thing that Black Panther Party, I mentioned them because they tried to raise the class question, which was really important. They really tried to raise the question of class. And when I say this is one of the most difficult struggles that we had, I'm talking about the anti-colonial sector, the pro-independence sector of the African liberation movement, this issue of class. One of the things that alienated the Black Panther Party from much of what would have been characterized as a pro-independence or anti-colonial movement was the way it dealt with the question of class. It would raise the question of class, but in a way that liquidated the struggle for national liberation. The class question is extremely difficult, has been in our communities in the past. It's because what we've suffered, you know, for the longest time has been clearly, I don't think that's going to be true at this period, but for the longest time, it was just the white man, the white people who was doing all this stuff to us. So there was a way that when you start talking about class, it was like dividing the population in the struggle against the real enemy, who was the white man. So there was a reflexive response in our communities to the notion of dealing with the question of class, identifying a sector of the population as a sector that was unreliable and sometimes even an enemy sector of the population, dealing with the question of class. Now, but the class issue is extremely important. And it's one that, you know, like Nkrumah, even when he talked about neocolonialism, he did not designate a particular class as being the vehicle through which neocolonialism operated. This was before Nkrumah himself had discovered the class question. It was only after Nkrumah was overthrown that he discovered the issue of class and, you know, wrote the book, you know, around class struggle in Africa. So, but the issue of class is important because if we don't deal with the question, it places us at a tremendous disadvantage. We do have to recognize that we live in a whole world that is that is dominated by capitalist imperialism, and which means that it is one that where class distinctions, class pronunciation, class organization is universal. It's universal in our reality. And in the past, we've been stuck with the problem of identifying. You can't tell an enemy of the revolution until he really, shows himself. And then when he shows himself, he was an Uncle Tom. Anybody could be an Uncle Tom. You understand what I'm saying? He was an Uncle Tom. That was how we dealt with it. We didn't have any kind of scientific means by which we could say that there are forces in our own communities who, based on their objective relationship to our community and how things are produced, that they are more likely to be friends of the revolution or more likely to be opponents of the revolution. We didn't have a scientific method of doing that. And as long as you call them Uncle Tom, that's why the question of class is important. Doesn't mean we say that the key elements of our strategic component, the most critical aspect of our revolution is the African working class, aligned with the poor peasantry. It's not because we got some fantasy about workers, because the workers, we know African workers, are as likely sometimes to do terrible stuff as the African petty bourgeoisie. It's no romance that we have. But what it is that the African working class has an objective relationship with imperialism, which once understood will more likely result in attack against imperialism. Whereas the African petty bourgeoisie benefits from neo-colonialism. Benefits. I mean, in fact, the neo-colonialism of the petty bourgeoisie is the means by which neo-colonialism reproduces itself through the African petty bourgeoisie. So it's more than likely that an African can be brought into contact with her real objective conditions in the world and then organized to move against that in the interest of the revolution than the African petty bourgeoisie, which sometimes may, but in order to do that, they got to do what Cabral called doing what? Commit class suicide and abandon the interests of the petty bourgeoisie and unite with the interests of the African working class. The petty bourgeoisie is a dying social force anyway, so when you try to hold on to that, you're holding on to death and destruction anyway. So neocolonialism is a place, is a structure that allows for the petty bourgeoisie to constantly be reproduce itself, et cetera, which is why, we have to attack neocolonialism. And I don't remember all of the components of the question that you just raised, but did I touch on any of it? You sure? Because I want to make sure that I do if I didn't. But, go ahead.
Just the idea that, I think you touched on it when you were talking about identifying who within our circles have
who within our, and within our own communities. And this is the crucial question that we have to see, that's what Obama is magnificent for us. Because after Obama, where the hell can they go? You understand? Wesley Snipes? And the fact is that sometimes it's not even important to fight against that nasty Obama. It's these conditions that we are confronting. Okay, you like Obama, but this is hell that we are living in these housing projects. People ain't got no romantic notion about this stuff that we're living in. They might be temporarily fascinated with this Negro up there, but this reality that we're confronting, that's the attack. And then we use this reality to explain Obama and all the neo-colonial forces. And the thing is about Africa, that's experienced neo-colonial domination since the 60s and what have you. I remember being in Paris in 1983, and this woman came up to me and she says, neo-colonialism, she said, the neo-colonialism must be destroyed, not only as a concept, but physically. You understand? I mean, so people know neo-colonialism now. They know that generally speaking, they do. I mean, I think if we introduce science to them, That's why Congo, there's an incredible struggle happening in and around Congo now, where the imperialists are raising up, they have two contending forces. Some of them, like, what's his name? Kabila on the one hand and Tshisekedi on the other hand. But what we are reminding Africans in the Congo of is that neither Kabila nor Tshisekedi could be in the mix if it were not for the murder of Patrice Lumumba. That's the last time any legitimate election has happened in the Congo, was when they murdered Lumumba, and they murdered Lumumba so that they could usher in a day of neo-colonial rule. They don't give a damn who the neo-colonialist is, what his last name is. Even they'll take another Lumumba and put him in place in order to carry out neo-colonial rule. So that's the thing that we are, that we are introducing and helping people to understand. That's an important struggle that we are involved in right now, the class question. And the neo-colonial use this better than we do in terms of we can't divide the people and all this kind of stuff when the people are already divided. They're not the people. They are not the people. Fred Hampton used to say, they're not the people, they're the pigs. They're the pigs. The Tshisekedis and the Kabilas and all these other, they are the pigs. The Obamas, they are the pigs. They're not the people, they are the pigs. And so we have to really, and we have to have a passionate belief in that. We really have to have a passion because the people, the suffering of the people, just because some Negro, has a title, and somehow we're supposed to have some kind of secondhand, wonderful experience because there's a Negro now, wielding a red, black, and green billy club, beating us into the pavement. No days like that. Uhuru Kamre, yeah.
Never accepted that. It rejects that because it accepts neocolonialism and it accepts the question of racism. And even though all these thousands of white people will demonstrate against the School of the Americas, training the death squad of Latin America, but not deal with the fact that those death squads are trained by the Los Angeles police or Washington, D.C. Police Department that have gotten their program through the attack on Africans. And, so this whole question is so clear. And again, the U.S. government is clear, but the right left, wants to protect imperialism and this relationship to African people, the colonial relationship to African people, white left wants to and I just think the question of counterinsurgency is so critical, to understanding and deepening this question of colonialism facing African people inside the US.
What we've got is something that's working at a couple of different angles, right? The counterinsurgency, is really important, the colonial question and counterinsurgency. But inside the colonial struggle itself, the anti-colonial movement, the question of class plays a really important role. For example, dealing with the question of the counterinsurgency, many people who call themselves part of the National Liberation Movement, whose names I won't call, but some of them religious, talking about the morality of black people. That's why we were doing crack and stuff like that. And that was the Nation of Islam, and some of them who were black nationalists, but actually literally working with the police. I mean, working literally. I don't mean this, like kind of sort of, but I'm talking about working with the police, particularly in Washington, D.C., the Republic of New Africa, and to take back our streets from the drug pushers and things like that, so that the drug pushers became the enemy, but not the system that put them in the community in the first place. They ended up uniting with it. And why? Why was it possible? Because who was targeted most by the imposition of a drug economy on our community? It was the working class, the African working class. It's these poor workers who felt, and so that's who we are. We are the party of the working class. And even when the working class is demoralized by defeat, maybe even being drug addicted, alcoholic, because that happens, you know, with defeat, but it's our class. We represent the interests of a class. That's why we could defend the class when all of them were defending imperialism, you know, by attacking the class. And that's what they were doing. They were literally, physically sometimes attacking the class. When what should have happened is those people who were out there even trying to deal with drugs, they should have been organized to deal with imperialism. That's the enemy, you know, and that doesn't mean that you don't have to do certain kinds of things to people who can't hear good. You take political education. Political education comes in 1,000 different ways. The Vietnamese use a lot of political education against Americans in this country. That's why you saw them all saying, hell no, we won't go. Because when they got there, the Vietnamese were educating them, you know, like with machine gun fire and everything else that it took to help them to understand they shouldn't be there. So political education takes all kinds of, you know, forms. But that's the thing, is even if there's somebody pushing drugs, we understand that it's the counterinsurgency that put them here. Even when we're spanking them and say, you're going to put that down and get out of the community or something, it's the counterinsurgency that has to be targeted. And what you need to be doing is fighting against this guy over here. That's the task. And class question played a role here, you understand, even within the so-called anti-colonial movement at the time. Uhuru Comrade. Yeah.
I just want to say that counterinsurgency and reparations were like the two things that really struck my brain when I read the book from the German, Reparation Now. Yeah. And counterinsurgency was just finally back to me. When I was maybe 9 or 10, 11, there was a book in our house, a small book, counterinsurgency in Congo. I'll look at it many times. I saw rebel faces, you know, people fought against neocolonialism in the early 60s, but it never really, you know, captured or explained to me what exactly was. So it's one of the concepts that really, you know, helped me to make this qualitative leap, basically. And whenever we travel to Africa, one thing we see is that counterinsurgency is very quick. You see that from the airport. Yeah. Be aware of rights, stuff like that. Why, you know, in Ghana, there will be giant posters against drugs. Who's sponsoring all that? Who's doing all this money to print all these giant posters? When we went to Sierra Leone at one point, 2008 it was, 2009, 2008 I think it was, there was a big tribe of so-called drug lords in Sierra Leone. And I said, what is this? Someone's being on trial. And these so-called drug lords. Why something like that? You had the U.S. Pushing Guinea, Equatorial, Guinea-Bissau. In all these countries, they have to have a campaign against drugs. And I'm sure this started from Africa or something like that. But I want to mention also this living conditions, which must be part of the counterinsurgency. Because when you're in Sierra Leone or in the Congo, those places, when you drink water, that's biological warfare. You're likely to catch diarrhea or something like that. When you're eating, you go flat. Just the condition of hygiene, unbearable conditions. And the parents know this condition alone will kill people even without organizers. Because when you see organizers in those places, many are sick. You know, and there is also this aspect of counterinsurgency, like what's happening. It's not probably in Uganda and Rwanda, Burundi, it's in Congo now. Well, almost every week, maybe every day, I'm not sure, but someone's being killed, but it's being killed with machete. And the body is laid down, you know, in the public, so everyone can see the body being mutilated and no dignity whatsoever. But it's ongoing. And we have all these rapes, like where someone will be raped in front of the community, and where in front of the house bank, councils everywhere. And these something that doesn't exist in our culture fabric of the community. Just that aspect of counterinsurgency is causing havoc. And what I want to ask Chairman is, can you comment on what's modern aspects of counterinsurgency within Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan? Because we know this general terrorist supposed to be an expert on counterinsurgency. What do we have to learn from that aspect of that?
I think one of the real things that we learned from Petraeus and the so-called modern counterinsurgents is it doesn't work. I mean that literally, because they haven't come up with anything new. The stuff Petraeus is talking about, this is something that we learned in the past, that our enemies are always fighting the last war. Do you understand? They're fighting the last war. When they talk about counterinsurgency activity, where do they get their understanding of it? It's the last thing that happened. What's the thing that's always advancing technologically and otherwise is the revolutionary process. Even, like in the communities where we live, that's where you find the advances, because they see how the imperialists are dealing or the cops are dealing, and they up the ante. They change the strategy, they change tactics, and so the counterinsurgents, the imperialists are always fighting the last war. That's how they go and plan. Say, how are we going to do this? We're going to fight counterinsurgents because this is the British came up with this model, the Americans came up with this model, so they're always fighting the last war. And what we saw that it didn't work, and they decimated a lot of people. In Iraq, and killing people right now. And right now, as we're having this discussion, Obama is sending drones to murder people in Pakistan and other places like that. But I think that one of the things that we've learned is it doesn't work, and it doesn't work if you've got organization. I should put it that way. If you've got organization, because there is an organized resistance in every place that they're trying to use counterinsurgency today. And what I mean by it doesn't work, I don't mean that they can't stop, like a process for a while, but they don't cure the disease. It's the way the imperialists work. They bring you cough medicine to stop you from coughing, but the disease that your lungs are being destroyed by something else that's involved, and that's what they can do. They can stop the coughing, but they can't stop the cancer. They can't stop the disease, and the disease, of course, is embedded in the whole damn thing. It was created with it, and that's the parasitism. And as long as the parasitism is there, then there's going to always be like the resistance, and the people learn from their experiences with the counterinsurgency as well. I think that one of the things that we see that they're doing, and a real problem is the isolation of the Africa and the Africa question in a certain way. One of the things we've talked about in the past is how, with all the stuff that's happening in the Congo, with demonstrations in the thousands in Paris, in London, sometimes even at the media headquarters, not a single word would they write about it. Nobody even knows that these thousands of people are demonstrating around what's happening in the Congo. Nobody even knows. There's a certain isolation. And our people experience a certain isolation. Isolation is terrible. That's why they have it in prisons and stuff like that, to isolate you, to keep you from, like a sense of your connection with anything else in the world, as a way to create demoralization and hopelessness. And look at what's happening, particularly in Congo, that Comrade Luezi was talking about, like the rapes and all these, other kinds of things that's going on, a form of terror. Counterinsurgency in this instance being, terror used against the people, as a form of counterinsurgency, demoralization, massive demoralization of populations, using drugs. Here's what they've done. They deny us the ability to function in the legal capitalist economy. Can't get a job. You know what that means in the African community. You can't get a job. Not only can you get a job, if you can't get a job, then you can't pay child support, right? You can't pay child support, then you lose your driver's license, right? If you lose your driver's license, you're going to drive, right? It means you got all of them charges stacked up, on you, because of that. It's just an ongoing array of population and resource control. use 1,000 different ways to make that happen. And isolation is a really fundamental problem that we have. That's why what we do is so important. To break the sense of isolation that's happening, like to our people everywhere fighting these particular struggles. And I think that we can learn from the Afghans, and we should. I mean that, because I remember when they murdered this brother Hydra Lacey in this city, who they say killed 2 cops and wounded another, and where the story will never be known. And unfortunately, nobody who loves black people so much cared enough to demand answers to the question of why they killed that brother, and then the same day destroy the damn house where the killing happened, and put the house on trucks and cart the trucks away. They call that destroying the evidence. And but that's what they did, but if the people out there, and they were pissed out there, if the people in this city, when Nicholas Lindsay was supposed, a 16-year-old child, just turned 16, killed the cop, and they brought into this community, they brought armored vehicles, they brought assault weapons carrying thugs in all the vests and artillery. They stopped every car with an African coming into this community, even the buses, and searched them, even though they didn't know who they were looking for, right? What is this? They didn't even know who they were looking for. They're stopping all the cars, opening their trunks, let us see in. Stop the buses, let us see in. Stopping people who are waiting for the bus out and sticking automatic weapons in their faces and stuff like that. Not a single white liberal or anything who loved us so much protested against it. There's not a single demonstration by peaceniks or anything else. This community, you know why, don't you? Because the police is the army that protects the white community from black people too. That's the sense that's there. If you ain't got no police, them niggas come in to get us. As liberal as I am, you understand? No resistance, no movement, like at all around that. But that's part of the terror and the sense of isolation. But if those Africans out there would have had an Afghan-style IED, as they're called. You know what IED is, what they call that? Improvised what? If the Africans out there would have had some IEDs, I'm telling you, they would have been used. They would have been used by this community. And so I think that we should really learn from, the Afghans and the Iraqis and all the other people who are struggling against imperialism, because we're going to have to fight our way out of this. They are not going to give this up, this life that they've created at expense. You think they're going to give it up? You look at what they're doing now with occupation because of the possibility of loss of 401ks, right? That's just your 401k that's being lost because the college tuition fees are going up too much. The college loans hard to pay for, and you're going to make a revolution to take the whole damn thing. You think that they're just go, oh, well, the Negroes are upset. They're right. Let's give them back everything. Hell no. Ain't going to happen that way. The police there, and so they see, they have a particular relationship with the police, even the left, even the so-called Marxists and communists. They will not stand here. That's why it's easy to support a struggle in El Salvador, recognize the Salvadoran resistance. It's easy to recognize the struggle someplace else, but here is where imperialism will be brought down to its knees, destroyed, wiped off the planet Earth. And that's why they can't support the struggle for black liberation in this country and around the world. So we have to build our own movement. And part of what this plenary and these discussions will do, part of what we have to do is to make our understanding of the world generalized so that peoples everywhere have the same understanding as we have. We have to become evangelists of a sort. I'm sorry, this comrade's back here been waiting to say something. I've been monopolizing the, yeah. Uhuru.
Yeah, Uhuru comments.
Yeah.
I just want to really start by giving you guys a warm greeting from the UK.
and Europe, and also just make a contribution to some of the work that we're doing in relation to the discussion we had previously and also now. First off, secondly, I would also thank the comrades from the UK for making sure that I was here. This is the first time I'm in the UK, sorry, in the US. So
Yeah, most of us got here the hard way.
yeah. I just want to highlight, the theory of ASI, because sometimes we read these sort of things and we don't really appreciate what it is that we're part of. If you take your mind back in August last year, when African youth in the UK rose up against the police, and they were ready to take on the police as long as possible. But you had these neo-colonialist British politician, the likes of David Lammy, some of you may know him. He's a politician for North London, Tottenham, where the rebellion began. You had someone like him, then you had another African politician called Dan Abbott in Hackney, another area where those Africans concentrated. And both of them were key speakers, if you like, speaking on my behalf. And they were attacking African youth, saying, oh, you African women, you should keep your children locked up and don't let them go out, and all this kind of stuff. And they were being used to attack the African community. And so you had that going on. And you also had some of the so-called liberation movements, some of the Pan-Africanists and what have you, who would look at what's happening in North Africa, Libya, they'll say, oh, that's imperialism.
Yeah.
But then when African youth were being gunned down in North London, they say, oh, the British police are racist.
Yeah.
Yeah. They could not make the connection.
Yeah.
So African youth knew, we had African youth being called looters.
Yeah.
And then called rats. I think one point they were called feral rats.
Yeah.
Politician, and they were called looters, and they were called all kinds of things, violent in fact. And so you had these two things happening. You had African youth rising up in North London. You had the British government attacking us in North Africa, and the two connections, the Pan-Africanists couldn't make the connection between the two. And African youth would be, so I guess the point I'm trying to make is that if we were a dominant force in the UK, and we would have been able to win African youth to understand that the bombers in North Africa already exist in North London, and we were able to make that ASI connection. Yeah. Because we see it today happening again with the Africans in the Congo, who would look at what's happening in the Congo and say, oh, that's imperialism, that's wrong, they're attacking us in the Congo. But then when the police arrest African youth, they can't make that connection. So they separate the struggles, they see it as something separate. Yeah. And of course, ASI is about making us realize that it's one struggle. One struggle. When we're struggling against the police in the UK, it's part of the struggle, against what's happening in the Congo. Because in terms of just linking back to the discussion about counterinsurgency, I just learned from one of the comrades in the UK. They were saying that basically, because he works for the council and they deal with people who just have more jobs and need housing. And what he said was that in December, when most of the protests took place in the UK around the issue of the Congo, the British government, as part of the counterinsurgency program, decided to give all these Africans who didn't have any document, they decided to give them the right to remain in the UK as part of the program to isolate them, because they know that Africans will go out and protest and say things against the government as a way of claiming evidence that we can't send back to the Congo because we're nothing by the government. So as a way of counterinsurgency, the British government decided to give all these Africans from the Congo documents to stay in the UK. Yeah. So you see this, you can see how the British government, they don't see the borders, but we as Africans, we see the borders. We see these kind of, we have these boxes. What's happening, So this is one of the weaknesses we find in the struggle to free Congo, is that Africans see these borders everywhere. So what I'm saying is that I'm just basically showing my appreciation for the ASI and the theory that we developed, because it means that we can struggle no matter where we are. Exactly. And what have you. So exactly. Uhuru.
I want to share with you also that Comrade Secretary General Louise Kinshasa, who has been an incredible leader. He's put us down in 4 countries in Europe. He's traveled with us and made struggles all over the world, but when we first started, you think England is bad now. We literally changed the political terrain in the African movement in England. We literally did. It was the weirdest experience I ever had going to England. You'd be in a meeting with 30 people in the room, and each one of them would stand up and say something about the same thing, and they say something different, and everybody act like everybody said the same thing. That was the weirdest experience I ever had in my life. And And I was the weirdo and the struggle, and because they'd say, well, you know, they're coming from America, you know, they just struggle really sharply and, unnecessarily. But that was a weird experience. And anyway, and when we got to England, we started doing work in England. You find a lot of people who now so much Africans and so much black, they weren't black when we got there. I mean, there they were black Brits. Many of them were black Brits. And they would not identify themselves as Africans because their strategic objective was black and Asian unity. Now, I know where Asia is, right? But I don't know where black is. You understand? So here you go. They liquidate the whole identity, right? And they could not call themselves Africans because their strategic objective was black and Asian unity. So if they call themselves Africans, and now the blackest people, the most African people in London, are those people who wouldn't be Africans when we first started having the struggles with them. You know, so opportunism, you know, it really helps to facilitate, like counterinsurgency. And in fact, neocolonialism is the highest expression of opportunism, isn't it? You know, a handful of people selecting, their own interests, short-term interests before the long-term interests of the masses of our people. Yes, Comrade Uhuru.
Well, first of all, I just want to say that to the ASI comrades that are here from Europe, that we've been watching on Uhuru News and YouTube. We've seen all the videos, and it's just been a real inspiration to see incredible work that ASI is doing there. So, Uhuru.
Yeah. See Makola and the guy describing it and making the struggle. That's been incredible. Everybody was so inspired watching you, involved in that struggle. Yeah.
And I just want to make two quick comments that came to my mind during the discussion about the counterinsurgency and the drug war. There was a case recently in New York where an 18-year-old named Ramarley Graham, an African, was chased into his home by New York police and was shot and killed, and he was unarmed, and they said he had marijuana on him. That was included in the news report, as if that was a justification. And it just, part of the importance of the understanding the counterinsurgency is that it does reveal that the state and the police have a different relationship to the African community than they do with white people. Yeah. And you see that in cases like that. Having marijuana on you, if white people met a death sentence, every time a white person had marijuana, then, as you said, Chairman, the USF dorms. Yeah. Or most occupying encampments, actually. Yeah. The second thing I wanted to say is that you mentioned Afghanistan and how counterinsurgency, what you see in the counterinsurgency operations in places like Afghanistan is that it doesn't work. It reminded me of something that someone told me recently. General McChrystal made a comment that in Afghanistan, he used the term Afghan math, and what he meant is that if you have 10 Afghan insurgents, the U.S. kills 2, 10 minus 2 equals 20.
Yeah, incredible, that's right. Yeah. What does Black Stalin say? More come, yeah, interesting. Uhuru. I think that one of the things that happens to us in places where we exist and struggle, to exist, is intentionally the imperialists have kept us in a state of real desperation, so that our backs are always up against the wall. You don't have time to reflect. When every day you get up, you got to run out and try to find. They spend all day just trying to get a meal for that day. There's a way that it's a bestialization, of us, because that's one of the things that distinguishes humans from other animals is consciousness. But if they can put you in a situation where every day that you're fighting instinctively just to stay alive, right? You don't have time to reflect and develop, like organization and plans and theory and stuff like that to fight the oppressor. And I think that consciously sometimes that's what I really believe that some states of our situation is just to keep our backs always up against the wall. always up against the wall. So the immediate question is always the question we deal with. The immediate question: how do I get this pig to stop hitting me? How do I, get just enough money to pay the light bill? How do I, have the ability to do this? And people dealing on such a basic, level often find it difficult to deal with, like questions of, long-term significance. However, what happens is that we find ourselves more and more in situations where the situation becomes so bad that people have no choices but to strike out and fight back. So, Uhuru. Uhuru, children. Uhuru, children. You know I know you, don't you? I got your number. You know that, don't you? Okay, all right. So, okay. There's nobody up there, so we're going to take, what do we do now? We break for what? Oh, excuse me. All right. Uhuru.
Okay, Uhuru, comrades. We are going to break now for some lunch. I do want to make a couple announcements before we do so.